Shalom and welcome to the 119 Ministries podcast. I'm John Sherman and this is David Wilbur.
Hey everyone.
We're part of the teaching and research team here at 119 Ministries.
That's right. And this podcast is our chance to connect with other teachers and ministry leaders to discuss the scriptures and what God is doing around the world.
So please be sure to like and subscribe to the 119 YouTube channel. We release new content every week. Also, connect with us online at testeverything.net and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we hope that you're blessed by this discussion.
Welcome everyone to the 119 Ministries podcast. We hope you all are doing well. We're excited to talk to our friend John McKee today. John is a Messianic scholar and theologian. He's an author of a bazillion books, a lot of books that he's written and papers. And he runs a ministry called Messianic Apologetics, which is focused on addressing the theological and spiritual issues of the broad Messianic movement. So we're so excited to have John on the show today. John, why don't you say hi to everyone?
Gentlemen, pleasure to be with you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, John. It's a blessing to have you with us. John Sherman, why don't you go ahead and kick it off with our first question for John McKee?
Yeah, absolutely. Shalom, John. Thanks for joining us here today. So you're a theologian and an author, and I also understand that you're a member of the Evangelical Theological Society, the Evangelical Philosophical Society, and you're also a recipient of the Zondervan Biblical Languages Award for the Greek. So, wow, that's a lot going on. I remember just kind of going through a lot of your articles that you've published online early on, and me coming into the Torah and realizing that we should be observing the Torah and the faith through Yeshua. And so I've always appreciated your work ever since the birth of all that in my faith. So I'd just be kind of interested, a little bit more about your background. I think would be nice for the audience to kind of hear some of that. And how did you become a believer in Yeshua, Jesus, the Messiah? And can we also hear about your educational experience, how you became part of the Messianic movement, if you will?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I'm originally from the greater Cincinnati or northern Kentucky area. My family has deep involvement in just things of the Lord, ministry. I come predominantly from the Wesleyan holiness tradition. My parents were lay leaders in the church. My father was a Sunday school teacher. My parents, growing up, were involved in activities like the Walk to Emmaus, a weekend retreat. My father was the first men's leader of the Walk to Emmaus in Madras, India in 1991. So definitely been exposed from a very early age to, religious, spiritual activities, ministry activities. My great-grandfather was a bishop of the Methodist Church in the 1940s and 1950s, so definitely have a heritage of, godly predecessors in, service to the Lord. But I would have to say most significantly, when I look back on my past, my parents in the 1980s were very responsible for bringing at the time, the Jewish roots of Christianity to their Methodist church. And my father would, as a Sunday school teacher and as a lay preacher, would be making, particularly during the spring season, a huge number of connections for people between the Exodus, the Passover, and the sacrificial work of Yeshua. So definitely been exposed to Messianic things, even from our church days back in the 1980s. Now, my father died of cancer in 1992, and just a very brief overview of our story. My mother got remarried in 1994. We moved to Dallas, Texas, and as this new blended family was coming together, it was very clear that we were not going to be Methodist and we were not going to be Bible church. So in the course of, what are we going to be now? We spent a very brief time in the charismatic movement, but then at the end of 1994, my parents went on a tour to Israel, And then they came back, and while they were in Israel, the Lord gave them a distinct word that they needed to start keeping the feasts. Wow. And so by the fall high holidays of 1995, we were plugged into a Messianic Jewish synagogue. And of course, once you get involved in a Messianic congregation, then you're prompted to consider your relationship to things like Shabbat, the appointed times, a kosher style of eating, among other things. You just have to, because you're involved in a very different religious or spiritual experience. So I have been involved in the Messianic movement formally now for 25 years. But going back to some of those very early days in Messianic Judaism, a very different style of worship. Of course, you've got new holidays that you're remembering. There are new and different weekly and annual activities. Very exciting time, actually, to be a believer. But at the same time, you get exposed to what it means to participate in some kind of an Israel-centric approach to what is happening in the world. In the mid to late 1990s, with the impending new millennium and Y2K, we also had the Middle East peace accord between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. Huge amount of end time speculation, huge amount of changes taking place with technology. And, a lot of people thought that, the return of Yeshua was just around the corner. So as we were getting integrated into the Messianic movement and the Messianic lifestyle, we were also being asked many questions about eschatology in the last days, and we're forced to go to the Bible in a very significant way, like we had never turned to the scriptures before. So it was a very important learning experience. But we made mistakes along the way, and as we were consciously and very very in a very significant way embracing our faith heritage in Israel scriptures, we also got to see how the Messianic Jewish movement is a first-generation movement. And like all first-generation movements, there are significant things that it to this day is still working through. Being around Jewish believers in Yeshua, struggling with questions like, I believe in Yeshua, am I still Jewish? Because my community is telling me that I'm not. My family members are telling me I am not. What do I do about my family who doesn't believe in Yeshua? Learning about the Jewish struggle and history, Christian anti-Semitism, the Zionist movement, these kinds of things, very important for our early days in the Messianic walk of faith. And indeed, they continue to be very important and pressing issues for us as a ministry. Now, having been involved with the Messianic movement since 1995, we have certainly been exposed, and we've interacted with all of its different sectors by now. We are aware, not just hearsay, but from on the ground, firsthand experience regarding the different issues and controversies that we face. When we were called into the Messianic movement in the mid-1990s, the flood of non-Jewish believers had just started. The mid to late 1990s is usually considered the time when a lot of non-Jewish believers were coming into the Messianic movement, and there were a lot of different responses as to why this is the case. But more than anything else, the initial carrot or the initial reason, or if you like, for why they were coming in had to do with, we want to live more like Yeshua and his first followers. So that's a lot of my initial Messianic experience in the 1990s. I've been in the Messianic movement since I was a freshman in high school. So I've been able to see a lot of things, from their very beginning, or certainly early beginnings. Now, along with this, I went off to college in 1999 to 2003, the University of Oklahoma. Now, once you leave the proverbial nest and you go off on your own, that's when you get to figure out, well, who am I? What do I stand for? What are my beliefs? Because you don't have your parents hovering around you, and you have to decide, what, and in this case, what do these messianic things mean to me personally? So, like anybody going off to college and who's a believer, I got involved with different on-campus ministries, groups like, Campus Crusade or Chi Alpha, groups that were certainly either broad tent, but definitely Israel friendly. So they wouldn't look at you studying, the Old Testament, in detail with any kind of negativity. They wouldn't look, and if you said, well, we go to a congregation that's involved in Jewish outreach and evangelism, okay, that's great. So these are broad tent types of groups, but you get into Bible studies and you certainly get asked about your messianic beliefs. You certainly get asked about, well, what are some of the things you do differently? And so in some of those discussions, I realized, and again, we're talking the early 2000s here. We're talking, 18, 19, 20 years ago. There were not a huge array of resources available. In fact, I would say the main resource that was available in a broad sense to everybody, because the internet is very new. Websites are very new. There is no YouTube, there's no Facebook, there's no Twitter, there's none of that.
Whole different world.
It was. And so one of the major tools out there at just about everybody's disposal was the 1995 Jewish New Testament commentary by David Stern, which everybody kind of has a copy of if you're involved in this movement. And that was, it's a useful tool, but it's dated. And it was even dated then. And there are things that addresses, really well, but then there's some things it just doesn't talk about at all. So being asked all these questions, from friends, from acquaintances, people I'm involved in Bible study, I realized that the Lord was pulling me into some kind of ministry service. And that's when I started, okay, I'm in college. Let's start taking Hebrew. Let's start taking Greek. Let's start taking various ancient histories and related topics to biblical studies. And I was able to, research issues at a, much deeper level than some of the materials like the Jewish New Testament commentary had done. I was spending time in the library, as opposed to, going off and partying and getting drunk and all that kind of stuff that other people do. Don't worry, I've caught up significantly since then. No, I'm just kidding. But I spent a lot of time, in the Word. I spent a lot of time, really refining some arguments that need to be made for what was coming in the future, if the Messianic community was truly going to expand and have the influence that at least I believe it needs to have. Now, after graduating, I took about a year and a half off before starting my MA in Biblical Studies at Asbury Theological Seminary. Now, the important thing about Asbury is it is one of America's, top evangelical seminaries, but it's also from my own Wesleyan faith tradition. It's not like I was going to the school without any knowledge about, okay, what am I going to expect here? What am I going to expect there? What do they stand for? I already knew what they stood for because this is what I grew up with. My parents went to different activities at Asbury College. It's now Asbury University, and the seminary is right across the street in Wilmore, Kentucky. I attended a satellite campus in Orlando, and the 3.5 years getting my master's degree, very important for refining my skills as an interpreter, as an exegete, and more than anything else, being able to engage with contemporary biblical scholarship. It's not like I'm unfamiliar with some of the arguments out there on many of the controversies that are being faced by men and women of faith today, whether they concern things that are more important to us as Messianic people, Second Temple Judaism, the ongoing relevance of God's Torah, but even things like the debate over homosexuality. That was a huge issue, back in 2005 to 2009. And how do you approach that at an academic level? And how do you respond to that as ministers trying to help people grow in their walk with the Lord? So, that gives you a very brief overview a lot of how I got involved in Messianic things. I joke and I say that, well, my parents dragged me into the Messianic movement, kicking and screaming, and then I had to just figure out, what am I doing here, and I had to defend myself on my own. They just
kind of speaking of that. I mean, your parents, obviously influenced you into what we call the Messianic movement. But is there any particular moment that you're just like, because you're going off the college, you're as you said, you're now removed from your parental environment. Is there a particular moment that you kind of felt challenged in observing the Torah, or is there a particular moment that you just said, hey, I'm absolutely convinced now that the Torah is what I'm supposed to be following? Or is it just something that that you just were doing with your parents and you just continued doing through college and never really had an experience that really challenged that moment?
Well, I would have to say perhaps the most challenging year that I had, because, and we'll get into this later in our discussion, I didn't come from a faith tradition that believed in the wide-scale abolishment of the law of Moses.
Okay.
I came from a faith tradition that always looked to at least what it artificially would classify as the moral law as a source of holy living. So I didn't have to be convinced that, the Torah as still for today. I already believed that. It was just on some of these other aspects that I needed to do more research. Right. But when I was a junior, so this is 2001, 2002, one of my roommates was the son of a minister. He was a pastor's kid, and his brother was a pastor. So it was a good learning experience because, on the whole, we found far more things to agree on than disagree about, but we had a lot of very candid conversations. And he was actually someone who, as his primary reading Bible, used the New Living Translation, which, okay, maybe that's what worked best for him.
Right.
But the New Living Translation is paraphrased, and it incorporates a lot of interpretive value judgments. So, but it was a good experience because he would ask me questions on the New Living Translation. I'd have to say, well, let's pull that up in my Bible software right here, and let's see what a better approach might be. Just looking at some English versions and then looking at some original language things. So 2001, 2002, that's what really was like, okay, what are you going to do with this Messianic thing? And what contribution do you want to make to the Messianic experience moving forward with your life? So I would say 2001, 2002, that was kind of the year of really feeling the pull to what would eventually be full-time ministry.
So that's a really good dovetail into this next question. I know that I personally and we at 119 Ministries have benefited from your ministry, Messianic Apologetics. How did this ministry come about, and what would you say is the vision and mission of this ministry? Absolutely.
Well, Messianic Apologetics is actually a part of a larger ministry, Outreach Israel Ministries. And together, my parents, Mark and Margaret Huey, and myself are all a part of Outreach Israel Ministries, which is an educational Messianic ministry. Now, our ministry began in 2003, so right after I graduated from college, basically, I got thrust into full-time ministry. We, at the time, saw a huge need for there to be fair-minded and well-balanced materials to produce specifically to handle the large numbers of non-Jewish believers that God was calling into the Messianic movement. And a huge reason why we started our ministry was, we made some really bad mistakes in the late 1990s. We said things that if we could go back in time, we would absolutely change them. And, we we did things that, again, if we could go back in time, we would change them. And then quickly you learn, as you get to know, particularly a lot of the leaders in Messianic Judaism, we were hippies and we did pot and all kinds of narcotics. So actually, okay, well, a few misstatements that doesn't seem so bad now. But we wanted to help the people like us who God was drawing into the Messianic community. We didn't want them to make an unnecessary scene with their family. We didn't want them to unnecessarily terminate relations with their pastors or Sunday school teachers. We wanted their coming into the Messianic movement to be a positive experience, something that was led by God's Spirit, and something which would hopefully impact those whom they had left in a positive and at least thought-provoking way, not one where you had to break fellowship and never talk to these people again. Because one of the things that you do learn about when you get involved in the Messianic movement is Jewish people argue issues endlessly, and Jewish people argue issues until they're blue in the face, and yet and then afterwards they go off and they have nosh together, and you're like, what? How is that possible? If I were having an argument with these people, I would think that they wouldn't exist at the molecular level. I'd want nothing to do with them. Recognizing some of our faults as humans was a real big thrust to, we've got to be in Messianic ministry. We got to present a way for people God is calling into the Messianic community that is constructive and that is positive, because when the Lord convicts you about certain things, yes, absolutely, you want people to make the same transition that you've made, but you want to demonstrate that you're becoming more and more like the Lord, and that just doesn't happen when you can be mean-spirited and obnoxious and what have you. Now, as far as Outreach Israel goes, our main outreach is through Messianic Apologetics. This is the a division of the ministry that I oversee, through the publication of various books, commentaries, ongoing research projects, and the tough questions are always brought to me. What do you do about this, and what do you do about that? One of the frequent questions that I get asked is, what is apologetics? Are you having to apologize for messianics all the time? Well, yes, actually, I do have to apologize for messianics quite a bit. But more technically, apologetics is the defense of the faith. And so anything concerning messianic apologetics would involve those things which affect people in today's messianic movement. Some of these issues affect all men and women of faith. Some of these issues affect people in evangelicalism, in the synagogue, but how do these issues specifically affect us? And so how do we tailor certain controversies to what is happening in our own faith community? My major goal in Messianic Apologetics, and people ask me this, what are you here to do? What are you trying to see achieved? My number one goal is I simply want to facilitate stability. I simply want to facilitate stability. And when people hear that answer, like, wow, you really have your work cut out for you. I know. I know. And, how do you respond to this? Perhaps scotch, perhaps bourbon. No, I'm just kidding. But no, a lot of prayer, a lot of forgiveness, a lot of patience, and you're never bored. There's always something to do. Now, today in the year 2020, many of us, we entered into the year 2020 and we said, oh, 2020 is going to be such a wonderful year. God's going to give us 2020 vision, and we're going to see what the future is going to be like. And yeah, 2020 vision, and a lot of things are coming out that are very disturbing. But in 2020 today, we believe that our faith community has a twofold mission to it. The number one mission that got the whole Messianic movement started to begin with would be to declare the good news of Israel's Messiah to the Jewish people, in anticipation of a massive Jewish salvation in the last days, which will culminate in Yeshua's return. Many of the things that we see Paul communicate in Romans 9, 10, and 11. But then number two, and this is something that many people in our early days and then being involved in the Messianic community didn't anticipate, even though it's just as biblical, is we're here to help non-Jewish believers that God has been directing into this movement, people who've been directed into this movement in distinct fulfillment of the prophecies regarding the nations streaming to Zion in the end times to be taught from Moses' teaching. That's Isaiah 2:2-4 and Micah 4:1-3. So we have our work cut out for us. We really do. And we're definitely a clearinghouse of ideas between, many different sectors that at sometimes are at each other's throats.
Well, speaking of the work that you have cut out for you, you've put together a lot of resources, and some of those resources, like you mentioned already, are books. I'd like to kind of transition now to talking about a book that you wrote called The New Testament Validates the Torah. It's a book that our ministry has actually benefited from because we quoted you a few times in our book, The Pauline Paradox. Can you give us a brief overview of that book, and why do you think it's important for believers to recognize the validity of the Torah?
Absolutely. Well, externally, that would mean outside of our faith community. In my experience, the biggest area of questions, criticisms, but also attack does regard our wide-scale conviction that God's Torah remains relevant instruction for his people today. Now, we might have some internal disagreements from time to time regarding how that Torah is to be applied in the 21st century, but all of us on some level believe that God's Torah remains relevant instruction. It's not something that's been abolished. It's something that is to inform us regarding the character of God, how God acts in history, and what God has planned for history. And so when you believe that God's Torah remains relevant instruction, and that when there's some controversy today, that I need to turn to this to inform me on some level about what I should believe and what I should be doing, that can change a lot of one's perspective. But perhaps more so than not, it can cause one to enter into conflicts with various faith traditions and various theological systems that say, the Torah, the law of Moses, that was for a previous time. It was just to be followed by the Jewish people before the arrival of the Messiah. Now that he has come, it's been abolished, and it's for nobody to follow. And maybe at the very most, we just have to read it for biblical history. So when you believe that God's Torah is relevant for today, that's going to run you into some very big controversies regarding different interpretations of passages, particularly from the Pauline letters, Hebrews, some other places in the apostolic writings that need reevaluation. Now, all of us in our Messianic experience, all of us have been issued a question, a comment, some kind of scathing rebuke about why the law has been apparently abolished. Again, we are human, we make mistakes, but we've probably all responded at one point or another back to such a question in an inappropriate manner. And we've actually created more of a problem for us than we needed to. And so going back to 2001 and 2002, I made some really bad mistakes, particularly in interactions with my roommate, the pastor's kid. And I realized I need to go do more study myself. I need to go acquire some more detailed skills myself. I need to go do better homework, because if I don't, moving ahead in the future, this is just a college roommate. If the Lord calls you into full-time ministry, the place to make mistakes is not in front of an audience of several hundred people. The place to make mistakes is, with those one or two people who you can go back to and say, hey, I'm sorry, I apologize. But there are certain things in getting prepared for ministry. There's certain experiences you have to have. You got to get certain things out of your system. And so as I was getting things out of my system, as I was completing college, as the Lord was calling me into full-time ministry, the book, or the material for the book, New Testament Validates Torah, was a consequence of me encountering a dispensational pastor's bullet points, his paper, where he said, these are all the reasons why the law of Moses is abolished. And not only that, but it wasn't for the Jews after Messiah, and so it's certainly not for anybody else. And going through a lot of these reasons, I found that, okay, this pastor was taking statements from an English Bible translation. He's only looking for bullet points, so he didn't go into anything regarding the Greek source text, and certainly didn't discuss a variance of interpretation present among different Protestant theological traditions, some of which were at least more positive to what they would consider to be the moral or ethical aspects of the Torah. So recognizing this as a student of God's word, wanting to sincerely find answers, this began compiling the information that would be incorporated into the New Testament Validates Torah. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I come from the Wesleyan theological tradition. When you look at the three main traditions that come out of the Reformation, you've got the Lutheran tradition, which actually does tend to pit God's law and God's grace as being enemies of one another or polar opposites. You look at the Reformed tradition or the Calvinist tradition, and it has historically subdivided, I believe artificially, but it subdivided the Torah's commandments between moral, civil, and ceremonial. And so it's always believed, at least in a general sense, that the Torah of Moses has some significant degree of relevance for God's people. And then the Wesleyan tradition follows in the Calvinist tradition's wake, although it tends to be has more of a focus on how do we implement the moral law, or what it calls the moral law, in view of Yeshua's teaching of the Sermon on the Mount, and being exercise good works toward neighbor through like humanitarian means, building orphanages and hospitals and schools and whatnot. So I've never believed in a broad sense that God's Torah was abolished. I've always believed in a broad sense that it's for today, that it's relevant. And in fact, all of us in this movement believe in a broad sense that it's relevant. So in wanting to engage at a much more detailed level with different Bible passages, certainly being an undergraduate student with some preliminary Hebrew and Greek and different ancient histories was useful. But when I got to seminary, that's when I was able to acquire some skills that were really quite invaluable. And being able to access, very technical, lexicons, technical commentaries, and seeing that, oh my goodness, some of these issues that Messianics think there's no answer to this. Actually, if you look hard enough, sooner or later, you're going to bump into people who have proposed the conclusion you're coming to at some point or another regarding a Bible passage or a verse or what have you. Romans 10:4 is an excellent example of this. Romans 10:4 in most English Bibles is Christ is the end of the law. But yet, you can look at an English Bible and you can see a footnote that'll say telos or goal. And so it's like, okay, well, if it's translated Christ is the goal of the law, that's a much more better rendering. But then you get into Romans commentaries and you see pages upon pages of discussion regarding, well, telos cannot mean goal. And then you see people say, no, it has to mean goal. The Apostle Paul has a very positive view of the Torah of Moses. And being able to enter into these discussions and being able to document different quotations of scholars and examiners is very, very important because we cannot, moving forward as the people of God, have simplistic canned answers to the questions that get asked of us. We have to demonstrate that we really have done our homework, that we know what we're talking about, that we're not just trying to defend our position of power or influence, but that we really are trying to be engaged with the will of God throughout the ages. And so these are the kinds of factors that led to the release of the New Testament Validates Torah. Now, there are actually two editions of the New Testament Validates Torah that our ministry offers. There is the standard edition, which was released in 2012, and that kind of follows the outline of that dispensational pastor's paper, responding to some of these arguments. And when we respond to arguments, it's not as though we're trying to find complete areas of disagreement. There are things we're going to agree with these people. There are things we're going to disagree with these people on. But that resource almost exclusively involves just the general validity of the Torah. Now, in 2017, our ministry released a really much larger, fat edition of this book called the Maximum Edition, which mainly took into consideration other arguments like going beyond the general validity of the Torah, things that would address Mark chapter 7 and Peter's vision of Acts chapter 10 and things like that. And we were able to transplant entries from our ministry practical Messianic commentary series into this massive resource. So, we release materials that we hope are going to help people in a very thorough way. They demonstrate that we know that there not only are these positions out there, but we can engage with them at a level that is constructive, positive, and that actually addresses some of the circumstances taking place on the ground in today's Messianic community.
Well, yeah, thanks, John. It really is an amazing resource. And exactly as you said, there is a need to be able to engage with scholarship and provide a scholarly basis for our arguments. I just think that's so important. And you do an amazing job at that, of really going through pretty much every position on a certain verse, quoting different scholars, the various opinions, and then examining the strengths and weaknesses of each position. And so that's something that I really appreciate. I wanted to get into a few specific questions related to the content of your book and just kind of get your take on them. As you said, you do get into these issues in a lot more detail in your book. But I wanted to hear your explanation of this. One of the objections I often hear from other Christians and believers whenever the topic of the Sabbath or dietary instructions comes up, it'll go something like this. Well, Paul says we are not under the law. We're under grace. Therefore, those laws don't apply to us. So how would you address that objection? And does the fact that we are not under the law mean that we do not have to keep certain laws anymore, as has been said, on a popular level?
That is an excellent question, David. And indeed, I don't know of a single Messianic person who hasn't been chastised with, we're not under the law. You don't have to concern yourself with any of this. All of us have had that directed to us at some point or another. And one of the things that I think is absolutely important, and this concerns the issue of Torah validity and concerns a lot of theological issues. So many people are caught repeating different sound bites, and they, their theology is composed of a half verse here or a half statement there. And when I was in seminary, we had to take several courses, in fact, 3 courses on inductive Bible study, just in English, reading an entire text in a single sitting and keeping some kind of a journal regarding different observations you would make or different questions that you would have from the text. And then from there, you would perhaps need to go into either the original language, some kind of background. And then after you've exhausted that, what have people been saying about this? What have people been debating about this? And so in Romans 6:14 and 15, we've all encountered this before. You see, and I'm reading from my New American Standard here, for sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. What then shall we sin because we are not under law, but under grace? May it never be. And so frequently, there is this understanding, and I believe it's a huge problem, because in contemporary speech today, being under the law means having to follow the law. But is that what it means to Paul? And so just reading these 2 verses here, it's very safe to deduce that being under grace is a status that those who are redeemed in Messiah benefit from, but being under law is the exact opposite of that, and seemingly that's a status that the unredeemed who are not in Messiah are not benefiting from. And that's a conclusion that, I know people in the Messianic community, they read and they're like, well, yeah, I'm a believer. I'm under grace. I am, spiritually regenerated. I'm cleansed of my sins. I'm a new son or daughter in the Lord here. But under law, seemingly that's a status that unregenerated sinners are suffering with condemnation and guilt. These are conclusions that people come to when they read these passages very organically. And then they might go to a pastor who will say, well, no, it really doesn't mean that. But what's interesting is you start cracking open technical resources on Romans, the NIV Study Bible. And then I think one of the greatest quotations I've been able to find on this was from Douglas Moo in the book 5 Views on Law and Gospel by Zondervan. Douglas Moo does not believe in any kind of validity of the Torah for today, but he says that there are 3 distinct ways that one can interpret the Greek clause hupa nomen, being subjected to having to follow the law of Moses, having to encounter some kind of legalism associated with the law of Moses, or being condemned by the law of Moses as an unrepentant sinner. So actually that third view tends to be the view that a lot of Messianic people are very open to, and they find it to be a textually rooted and viable answer to criticism. And then when you encounter different Romans commentaries, which at least list it as a possibility, they're like, good. I'm not just out of my mind here. Somebody has at least said this is a legitimate possibility. But even more so, you get into, like in my case, turning to the John Wesley's notes on the New Testament. He says under the law means being condemned by it as an unrepentant sinner. The famed 2-volume commentary on Romans by C.E.B. Cranfield, it says under the law in Romans 6:14 and 15 means being condemned by it as an unrepentant sinner. So, you do enough homework and you're able to find that you're not off your rocker. There are people who have proposed these things before, and it only strengthens your case. It doesn't weaken it, but it does take time and it does take patience. Now, moving on from Romans 6:14 and 15, there are only a few places in the apostolic scriptures where in the source text, the clause hupa nomen appears. And these would be, Romans 6:14 and 15. In 1 Corinthians 9:20, it appears 4 times. Galatians 3:23, 4:4, 5:21, and 5:18. And that's very, very important because if you pick an English translation, I'm thinking more on the lines of the Revised Standard Version and its descendant, the English Standard Version. There are going to be more places where under the law appears where the source text does not necessarily say that. So these are some of the challenges that as more technical interpreters I have to face and I have to deal with, and I have to make a more Torah positive approach, something that is readable and something that's accessible to people who are engaged in debates between their relatives, between their former pastors or Sunday school teachers, whomever, and try to lessen the conflict. And so going into some of these commentaries and materials, that's hopefully going to make sure that people don't exchange blows before they have to.
Okay, John, that was fantastic and actually just quite interesting. It's good to know that, as people are coming into the Torah and realizing, hey, am I alone in believing what I believe or answering this particular question, especially about Paul? It's good to know that even mainstream Christian scholars have debated some of these things, and that we really aren't alone, and that we don't stand alone in all of this. And I think that, as you said, there's obviously value in doing some scholarly work and due diligence there. And it's just awesome that you're one of those people that is kind of, taking the helm there and focus on that in your apologetics-based ministry. One of the things I would like to comment on is, that many Christians say that like some laws, like the Sabbath, they don't apply to believers today because, we're in the new covenant, and those commandments are part of the old covenant. So your book is called The New Testament Validates Torah. So clearly you don't think that the new covenant or New Testament invalidates the Torah or parts of the Torah, as many Christians believe. So can you explain what the new covenant is, and how does the Bible's teaching concerning the new covenant actually affirm the validity of the Torah?
Sure, absolutely. Well, like many people, I have a personal quest to have a theology, have a worldview that is in alignment with the whole of God's word. And so I try to look at things holistically as they concern a different biblical issues. Mm-hmm. So in choosing a title like The New Testament Validates Torah, recognizing that you're going to have a huge Christian audience, which is trying to sort through what the Messianic movement's about, what does it say about the law of Moses? We're saying that it validates it rather than abolishes it or invalidates it. But you get into some of these terms. Many Christians today have this popular or even populist understanding that the new covenant is something completely new, completely different, and it's something that does not in any way, shape, or form involve the laws of Moses, the Torah, the Pentateuch, or what have you. Now, that is a popular Christian understanding from a lot of lay people. Yet, once again, you get into more of a serious, regimented, rigorous study of God's word. You discover very, very quickly that the new covenant is something that is prophesied and anticipated in the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34, and Ezekiel 36, 25 to 27. Some of the most important Bible passages for anyone claiming to be a believer, because the essential substance of the new covenant, which everybody would say is important, involves how the people of God are to be given a new heart and a new spirit, and that they are to have the commandments of God supernaturally transcribed onto their hearts and minds. And of course, people say, well, absolutely, the commands to love God and love neighbor. Unless you're spiritually regenerated, unless you have a new heart and a new mind, how can you properly fulfill those instructions? And I agree with that, absolutely. But when you get into some of the details involving the new covenant and what is specifically anticipated, you run into things like God writing his Torah, his laws, his commandments onto the hearts and minds of his people. And, what would those things be? What would what would Jeremiah's audience, what would Ezekiel's audience say that those things are? Are these just the instructions to love God and love neighbor, or does it involve other things as well? And if it involves other things as well, then what kind of reevaluations need to take place? Now, as it involves these two prophecies, it is true. When you look at some of the wider context of Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36, there are still yet to be realized aspects of this new covenant as they involve the corporate restoration of Israel in the last days. We believe that these things are going to be taking place, not only with what we've seen concerning the rebirth of the state of Israel in 1948, but ultimately it's going to culminate in the return of Yeshua. So there are still yet to be realized aspects in process. But that essential core of new heart, new spirit, new mind, writing God's instruction on the heart, that has been operative since the ministry of Yeshua and his sacrifice and resurrection from the dead. Absolutely. And I can't tell you how many Christian people out there, and it's something that grieves me a great deal, and I'm not alone in this. They do not realize that the new covenant is actually something prophesied in the Tanakh scriptures. But yet at the same time, as I have gotten into, very technical studies of the scriptures, Paul, Hebrews, whatever it is, how many scholars are quick to refer to Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36 as being operative? Of course, you see Jeremiah 31 quoted in Hebrews 8 and Hebrews chapter 10, but you also see references to the new covenant by allusion. Romans 8, 1-4. That is probably one of the most important places where scholars will connect the new covenant. Those of us who are walking in the Spirit, we fulfill the righteous requirement of the law. Absolutely imperative for us to understand that. But even beyond just recognizing that the new covenant, God writing his instruction on our hearts and minds is there, how do we do this as something that is compelled by his Spirit? Because you see a lot of people today who, they come into the Messianic community, they come into a lifestyle of Torah, and it's clear that they are not tempered by the love and grace and mercy of God. And is it a work of the Holy Spirit, or is it a work of the flesh? Are they trying to compensate for the lack of something in their hearts? Now, I don't know. I'm not God, but so many of the problems that we face are because not enough people are doing things of Torah by the empowerment of the Holy Spirit. And so a big part of our ministry, and it's a big part of coming from the Wesleyan tradition, is stressing, we have got to be obeying the Lord via the empowerment of his Holy Spirit. Yes, it involves acts of kindness and mercy toward other people, but it also involves things like, well, what are you going to do about Shabbat? What are you going to do about the appointed times? What are you going to do about the whole kosher topic? And if you are tempered by God's Spirit, you're not going to get into, rigidity. You're not going to get into legalism, and hopefully others can see that you are living more like Yeshua rather than less like him.
Amen. Well, thanks, John. Just another question for you. I know, I've been on this walk for, about 10 years now, and a big stumbling block to a lot of my friends that I've engaged with on this issue concerning the validity of the Torah is the Book of Galatians. And based on several passages from this letter, as you know, many say that Paul teaches against the Torah, particularly commandments like circumcision, like he actually discourages certain commandments, some people will say. So can you explain what Paul's agenda is in the Book of Galatians, and what is the issue exactly that he is addressing there? Because I think if more people can grasp what it actually is that Paul is dealing with, it may help them understand the debate a little better, the context of the letter a little bit better, and why Paul says things that he does.
Sure, absolutely. Well, it needs to be recognized that Paul's letter to the Galatians is the most difficult text of the Bible for today's Messianic people to have to deal with. And since you've given me these next 96 hours to explain some of the problems some of the challenges with Galatians, no, I'm just kidding there. But it is people, they read Galatians in an English translation. They, unfortunately, way too many people, and it doesn't matter where you are, they assume, and this is not only the case with Galatians, other epistles of Paul, other books of the Bible, they assume that this text is written directly to them in the 21st century. And the simple yet complicated rule of responsible biblical interpretation. What did this text mean to its original audience first? And how do I deduce principles for today? So most people who examine Galatians, their engagement level is with a few verses here and a few verses there. They don't recognize that perhaps there are some translation issues from the Greek source text into English. Perhaps there's some issues present from Second Temple Judaism that they are completely unfamiliar with. And then what are some of the perspective issues which have been demonstrated throughout history? Now, we know that for a figure like Martin Luther in the 1500s, he employed many statements in Galatians in his protests against medieval Catholicism. But over the past 50 to 60 years, many biblical scholars have said, hold on, wait a second, time out. Medieval Catholicism is not Second Temple Judaism. And okay, people who are legalistic and rigid and assume that human activities can merit eternal salvation, they've existed for millennia. But in terms of some of these specific arguments in Galatians that involve circumcision, that involve the terminology works of law, have we made some conclusions that need to be reevaluated? Galatians is traditionally read from the perspective that outsiders had come into the assemblies of Galatia after Paul had left, probably from his missionary journeys of Acts chapters 13 and 14. And they mandated Torah keeping for salvation on the part of some of these really new and naive believers. And so Paul writes this very impassioned letter to them. And he says, well, basically, the Torah was only to be followed by the Jewish people prior to the arrival of the Messiah. And now that the Messiah has come, nobody has to follow it at all. And so you need to be, as some people are saying today, de-hitched from the Old Testament. And that tends to be a common, widespread, popular view. Now, again, there are so many different views of Galatians out there. Some people don't take that strident a view regarding Galatians. They still believe that Paul has a very high view of the Torah in Galatians, at least as it regards the Torah's ethical and moral instructions. But that tends to be the approach that we encounter, certainly from today's evangelicals regarding Galatians. Now, not enough today recognize some of the proposals which have been made, not exclusively, but frequently by what's called the new perspective of Paul in biblical studies, something that came to prominence in the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s by scholars like the late James Dunn and N.T. Wright, proposing that, we really need to take some of the ancient Second Temple Jewish issues into account when interpreting Galatians. And so what would some of those issues be, or what could they be? Well, they would include things like, okay, all of the rhetoric against circumcision in Galatians. It's not so much rhetoric, well, you have to be physically circumcised in order to be saved, but more, it's a protest against being circumcised as a ritual proselyte to Judaism. So what is in view is, why is there all this rhetoric against circumcision? Well, a lot of it goes back to the fallout of the second century BCE Maccabean crisis, where we know Antiochus Epiphanes, he forced Hellenization upon the Jewish community and made it illegal to keep the Sabbath, the appointed times, eat kosher, but more than anything else, made it illegal to be circumcised. And so these are the kinds of things that the Jewish community fought and died for. And so as a result of the whole fallout of rightfully fighting and dying for a Torah lifestyle, well, what do we do about, people who want to acknowledge the God of Israel and be reckoned as members of God's community? How do they truly become reckoned as members of God's community? And so that's when you see the development of Second Temple Judaism of ritual proselyte conversion. And so frequently in Galatians, it's recognized now that circumcision is a shorthand for ritual proselyte conversion. Now, Paul would have nothing to do with this idea that if you truly want to be reckoned as members of God's own, you had to become circumcised as a proselyte. He said, now, wait a second. How do you become members of God's own? You place your faith or your trust in God, as it was with Abraham in the very beginning, and by extension, placing your faith and trust in Yeshua's completed work on the tree. That is how you were reckoned as members of God's own. But you got to understand, for many Jewish believers in the Second Temple period, they were very xenophobic. They were very afraid of all of these Greeks and Romans coming into the assembly. Are they going to become more like us, or are we going to become more like them? And in the process, are we going to commit apostasy? Because that is what happened during the Maccabean crisis. That was a constant threat of the Second Temple Jewish community, especially in the diaspora. And so if you want to truly be reckoned as members of God's own, if you truly want to be members of us, you've got to go through ritual proselyte circumcision. And so those are a lot of the issues that you see present in Galatians. The interesting thing today is that that is really not an issue in today's Messianic movement. Everybody recognizes today that how do you become members of God's own? By expressing faith or trust in God and in the Messiah that he has sent. Now, as it specifically involves the terminology, works of law, or ergon namu, huge amount of discussion in contemporary Galatians resources as to what this actually might mean. Many of us, just dealing with the text of Scripture, have assumed that works of law just means observing the law. In fact, that's how the NIV renders it. But however, is that truly what is the case? Is it just general Torah observance? In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a document 4QMMT. You read it, it goes through all of these basically community or club rules of the Qumran community. And a lot of them pertain to, different sacrifices and different other, very small, minute issues. But in the end, the summarizing remark is these are some works of the law that, you need to observe. And ultimately, it's you perform these various halachot, you perform these various applications, our interpretation of Moses' teaching, and you truly become members of our sect, our club. You're truly in. And so when Paul likely uses the terminology works of law, it's with the idea in mind that how do you truly become reckoned as members of God's own? Well, in the case of his opponents, is you've got to go through their ritual proselyte circumcision. And Paul's like, no, that is not how you become members of God's own. It's by faith in God and trust in what he has done through Yeshua the Messiah. So that just gives you some major points to consider regarding Galatians. And indeed, I've written extensively on Galatians. I'm aware of a lot of the arguments in Galatians. Another passage that huge amount of ink has been spilled on involves Galatians 3:23 to 25. You look at some English Bibles out there, very distinct translations like the New American Standard, the law was our tutor to lead us to Christ. And then you compare it against the Revised Standard Version, it says the law was our tutor or our disciplinarian or something until Christ came. And so huge debates regarding, is Paul talking about individuals on the way to salvation and how the Torah functions in some kind of a strict disciplinary manner until people realize, hey, I can't perfectly observe these things. I need the salvation of Yeshua in order to be set free from guilt and condemnation? Or is it instead the Torah was our disciplinarian or tutor until Christ came, the our being the Jewish people, and only Jews had to follow the Torah until the Messiah arrived. And if Jews don't have to follow it anymore, well, nobody else has to be concerned about it either. But these are significant arguments that are out there. And in this case, it involves the proper approach to the clause eis Christon. So Galatians has a lot that has to be considered very carefully. You have to be very patient, and above all, you do have to wade through a lot of opinions, and you have to say, okay, some opinions I find useful. Others, look at the fruit of these opinions. Look at what they have come to, because you can encounter Galatians commentaries today, which will say, Paul doesn't even think that the Torah of Moses communicates anything to us about ethics or morality. And by extension, what does that mean when you encounter Romans 1 and what it says about homosexuality? When you divorce Paul from Leviticus 18, why is Paul coming up with these instructions? Okay, you can say that he doesn't think it's a good idea, but you need the background of the Torah, the Tanakh scriptures. These are the scriptures of Yeshua and the apostles. This is the Torah and Tanakh scriptures. This is where they turned to when they had significant issues to wrestle with in terms of morality and ethics and values. Particularly as they declared the good news to the Mediterranean world and to Greeks and Romans who needed to turn to the God of Israel and needed to turn to the salvation available in Israel's Messiah.
Well, that was just fascinating, John. Very informative, but you're absolutely right. Galatians is just a very difficult text to properly discern and understand and apply. Not only correctly, but one of the things that we must do first, as you properly mentioned, is got to look at it from the right context, got to look at it from the right culture, from the right background, and realize it's written to a particular audience. And then, doing your work and due diligence and getting into the actual language itself, looking at other opinions and see what makes sense, seeing what doesn't make sense. But that's just so fast, and especially the Qumran commentary was just totally fascinating. I've heard that before, but it's been a while, and there's just so many components of Galatians that can be particularly confusing that there's just so much to pick through. We appreciate your commentary on that. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's always been a blessing and honor to talk with you today and get your perspective on these kinds of questions. So thank you.
My pleasure.
And you can check out John McKee at his ministry website, MessianicApologetics.net. Check out his book, The New Testament Validates Torah. And if you're interested in an in-depth scholarly resource on this topic, we highly recommend it. As we mentioned before, we've even quoted some snippets of it in our Pauline Paradox book. So thank you for all of you tuning into this discussion today. And be sure to connect with us on our website, testeverything.net. Also, look at Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. You can find us there and connect with us also. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please click the subscribe button until it turns blue, and click the like button as well. It helps with the YouTube algorithm, gets our content out there. So we pray that you've been blessed by this discussion. Shalom.
Shalom.
Shalom everyone, we wanted to make this quick video to let you know some exciting news. The Pauline Paradox is now available as a book from 119 Ministries. For years it has been taught that the Apostle Paul taught against the law of God. He wrote to the believers in Rome, "For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace." But just a short time later, in the same letter, he also wrote, "So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good." Was Paul double-minded about the law? How do we reconcile these and many other passages where it appears that Paul speaks both for and against the law of God? We tackle this question and many others in our new book based on our popular video series. You can get your copy of the Pauline Paradox at paulineparadox.com or search for it on Amazon. We hope this book will be a blessing to you and a useful resource in understanding why Paul did not teach against the law of God.